the crystal chandelier above our dining room table cast harsh shadows across my family's faces as they erupted into laughter. Not the warm, inclusive kind that brings families together, but the cruel, cutting variety that leaves permanent scars on a 17-year-old's soul. "Danny's college dreams," my older brother Marcus sneered, waving his acceptance letter to Harvard Medical School like a victory flag. "Tell them about your artistic vision again, little brother." I felt my cheeks burn as I pushed mashed potatoes around my plate, the words I'd practiced in the mirror dissolving on my tongue like sugar in rain. 3 months ago, I'd been accepted into the Rhode Island School of Design with a partial scholarship for my portfolio. It wasn't Harvard, but it was everything to me. My art was everything to me. "At least someone in this family has realistic expectations," my mother said, her voice dripping with false sympathy. "Danny, sweetheart, art is a wonderful hobby, but you need to think practically. Your father and I discussed it, and we think you should consider Marcus's suggestion about business school." My father nodded approvingly while cutting his steak with surgical precision. "Marcus has always been the smart one. Following his advice wouldn't hurt." Even my younger sister Claire, barely 14, felt compelled to join the chorus. "My friends think it's weird that my brother wants to be an artist. Can't you just be normal?" The only person who hadn't spoken was Grandpa Joe, my father's father, who sat at the head of the table methodically eating his dinner. At 82, he had a way of observing everything while saying little, his pale blue eyes taking in details others missed. "I saw Danny's paintings in his room," Claire continued, emboldened by the family's attention. "They're just weird, dark stuff. Like, who wants to look at that?" "Art should be beautiful," my mother added. "Uplifting. Your paintings are so disturbing." Marcus leaned back in his chair with the satisfied air of someone delivering a final blow. "Face it, Danny. You're not talented enough for real art school. This wrist thing is probably just a participation trophy. They accept anyone these days." The words hit me like physical blows. For months, I'd been working on a series of paintings exploring themes of isolation and family dysfunction. Clearly, I'd had plenty of inspiration. My art teacher, Mrs. Rodriguez, called my work hauntingly mature and emotionally sophisticated. But sitting at this table, surrounded by the people who were supposed to love me most, I felt like a fraud. "I think," I said quietly, my voice barely audible above the clink of silverware, "I'll just go to community college for a year, save some money." The lie tasted bitter, but it stopped the laughter. In truth, I was planning to defer my acceptance to RISD and work at the local coffee shop until I could afford tuition. I wouldn't give them the satisfaction of knowing they'd killed my dream, even if that's exactly what they'd done. "Now you're being sensible," my father said, returning to his steak. Grandpa Joe set down his fork with deliberate slowness. "Danny, walk with me after dinner." It wasn't a request. An hour later, I found myself in Grandpa Joe's wood-paneled study, surrounded by the musty smell of old books and pipe tobacco. He poured himself a glass of whiskey and gestured for me to sit in the leather chair across from his desk. "Your great-grandmother Rose was an artist," he began without preamble. "Painted the most beautiful portraits you ever saw. Had offers from galleries in New York and Boston." I'd never heard this story. Family history in our house usually began and ended with my father's business success and Marcus's academic achievements. "She gave it up when she married your great-grandfather. He convinced her it wasn't practical, wasn't suitable for a wife and mother." Grandpa Joe's eyes grew distant. "She never painted again, died with brushes still in her kitchen drawer, oils dried up and cracked." He pulled out a manila folder from his desk drawer and slid it across to me. Inside were photographs of paintings, stunning, realistic portraits that seemed to breathe with life. At the bottom right corner of each, I could make out the signature, R. Morrison, Rose Morrison. She took her husband's name, but she never stopped being an artist in here. He tapped his chest. The tragedy isn't that she quit painting, Danny. The tragedy is that she let other people convince her she wasn't good enough to continue. I studied the photographs, seeing something in the brushwork that reminded me of my own style. Why are you showing me this? Because I see her in you, in your paintings, in the way you see the world. He leaned forward, his voice dropping to almost a whisper. And because I won't watch this family destroy another artist. That night, I lay awake staring at the ceiling, Grandpa Joe's words echoing in my mind. But it wasn't just his story about Rose that kept me awake. It was something else he'd said as I was leaving his study. Your family thinks they know what success looks like, Danny. Maybe it's time to show them they're wrong. Over the next few weeks, I threw myself into my art with renewed intensity. But instead of the dark, introspective pieces I'd been creating, I began working on something different. A series of family portraits, each one capturing the subjects with brutal honesty. Marcus, painted in harsh fluorescent lighting that emphasized the stress lines around his eyes, his Harvard acceptance letter clutched in hands that trembled with the pressure of perfection. My mother, surrounded by the trappings of suburban success, but with hollow eyes that spoke of dreams deferred. My father, his business suit rendered in shades of gray, his face a mask of controlled emotion that hid the frightened boy underneath. And Claire, sweet, cruel Claire, painted as the child she still was, mouth open in mid-laugh, but with tears she didn't yet understand streaming down her cheeks. I worked in secret, using the art studio at school during lunch periods and staying late after classes. Mrs. Rodriguez noticed the change in my work immediately. "These are extraordinary, Danny," she said, studying the portrait of Marcus. "There's a sophistication here that's beyond your years. Have you considered entering the regional high school art competition?" I hadn't, but as she spoke, an idea began forming in my mind. The competition was prestigious, with judges from major art schools and galleries. Winners received cash prizes and, more importantly, recognition that could open doors to scholarships and opportunities. But it wasn't the official recognition I was after. The competition culminated in a public exhibition at the city's main gallery, an event that drew hundreds of attendees, including parents, teachers, and local media. "What's the deadline for submissions?" I asked. 3 weeks later, I submitted my family portrait series under the title, The Weight of Expectations. I didn't tell anyone what I'd done, not even Grandpa Joe, though I caught him watching me with knowing eyes as I worked on the final pieces in the garage. The notification came on a Tuesday afternoon. I'd won first place in the senior division. The exhibition was scheduled for a Saturday evening in November, the same weekend my family had planned a dinner party to celebrate Marcus receiving early admission to Harvard Medical School. The irony wasn't lost on me. "I can't make it to dinner on Saturday," I announced at breakfast that morning. "I have something I need to attend." "What could possibly be more important than your brother's celebration?" my mother asked, her voice sharp with disapproval. "The regional high school art competition exhibition. I won first place." The silence that followed was deafening. Marcus's spoon clinked against his cereal bowl. Claire looked up from her phone for the first time in weeks. "You entered a competition without telling us?" my father asked. "You never seemed interested in my art before," I replied, surprised by how calm I sounded. "I didn't think you'd care." "Of course we care," my mother said quickly, though her tone suggested otherwise. We had no idea you were talented enough to win anything." Marcus recovered first, his lawyer instincts kicking in. "Congratulations," he said, though the word sounded forced. "What did you paint?" Family portraits, I said, and left it at that. Saturday evening arrived crisp and clear. I stood in the gallery, wearing my best shirt and the tie Grandpa Joe had given me for my birthday, watching people examine my paintings. The reactions were everything I'd hoped for and more. Remarkable emotional depth, I heard one judge telling another. This young man has real talent. The psychological insight is extraordinary, agreed a woman I recognized as the director of a local art school. These portraits are like windows into the soul. But it was the reactions of people who knew my family that gave me the most satisfaction. Mrs. Henderson from down the street stood transfixed in front of Marcus's portrait, her hand over her mouth. "My goodness," she whispered to her husband. "Is that really how Danny sees his brother?" At 7:30, just as the exhibition was hitting full swing, I spotted them across the room. My entire family had arrived, dressed in their dinner party, finest but looking decidedly uncomfortable as they took in the crowd surrounding my paintings. I watched from across the gallery as they approached the first portrait, my father's. My mother's face went white as she recognized herself in the second painting. Her perfectly curated exterior stripped away to reveal the anxiety and disappointment underneath. But it was when they reached Marcus's portrait that the real drama began. My brother stared at his painted image for a long moment, his face cycling through confusion, recognition, and finally, rage. "He had no right," I heard him hiss to my parents. This is cruel." "Danny," my mother called across the gallery, her voice sharp enough to cut glass. "We need to talk, now." I made my way over slowly, aware that we were drawing attention from other attendees. The gallery's acoustics meant that our conversation would carry, and I found myself hoping for exactly that. "What is the meaning of this?" my father demanded, keeping his voice low but intense. "These paintings, they're not family portraits, they're character assassinations." "They're honest," I replied. "I painted what I saw." "You made us look pathetic," Claire whispered, tears starting in her eyes as she stared at her own portrait. "Everyone can see them. Everyone." "Maybe you should have thought about that before you made me feel pathetic every day for the past year," I said, and finally felt the anger I'd been suppressing bubble to the surface. "Maybe you should have considered how your words might affect someone before you spent months tearing down everything I cared about." Marcus stepped forward, his face red with embarrassment and fury. "You want to talk about being torn down? You just humiliated our entire family in front of half the city. For what? To prove some point about your precious art?" "To prove that I am an artist," I said, my voice rising despite my efforts to stay calm. "To prove that my art matters, that my dreams matter, that I matter." "This isn't art," my mother said desperately, gesturing at the portraits. "This is revenge." "No," said a familiar voice behind us. "This is truth." We all turned to see Grandpa Joe approaching, impeccably dressed in his navy suit, his silver hair gleaming under the gallery lights. He moved slowly but with purpose, stopping in front of Marcus's portrait. "I've been looking at these paintings for the past hour," he said, his voice carrying the authority that came with 8 decades of life experience. "Talking to the judges, the other artists, the gallery director." He turned to face our family, his pale blue eyes holding each of us in turn. "Do you know what they're saying about your son, your brother?" Nobody answered. "They're saying he has the rare gift of seeing past the masks people wear. They're calling his work unflinchingly honest and emotionally courageous." The director of the Rhode Island School of Design was here tonight, specifically to meet him. I felt my heart stop. RISD's director was here? She was, along with representatives from 3 other art schools and 2 galleries. Grandpa Joe's smile was slight but proud. Seems word got out about a 17-year-old who won the regional competition with work that's being compared to the great portrait painters. He reached into his jacket pocket and pulled out a business card, handing it to me. Dr. Sarah Chen, Director of Admissions. She'd like to discuss a full scholarship, room and board included. The gallery seemed to spin around me. A full scholarship to RISD, the dream I'd given up, handed back to me when I least expected it. But Grandpa Joe wasn't finished. He turned to face my family, and his expression hardened in a way I'd rarely seen. For months, I've watched you tear down this boy's confidence, mock his dreams, and treat his considerable talent like it was worthless. His voice remained quiet, but it carried the weight of absolute judgment. I've watched you celebrate mediocrity while ignoring brilliance. I've watched you repeat the same mistake your great-grandmother's family made nearly a century ago. My mother opened her mouth to protest, but Grandpa Joe held up a hand. I'm not finished. Danny didn't create these portraits to hurt you. He created them because an artist's job is to show truth, even when that truth is uncomfortable. Especially when that truth is uncomfortable. He gestured at the paintings surrounding us. Look around you. Look at how people are responding to his work. This boy has a gift that comes along maybe once in a generation, and you nearly convinced him to throw it away. Marcus found his voice first. We were trying to be practical. You were trying to make him into a smaller version of yourselves, Grandpa Joe interrupted, and you failed. Tonight, Danny showed this entire city what real talent looks like, what courage looks like, what artistic vision looks like. He turned back to me, and his expression softened. Your great-grandmother Rose would be proud. She never got the chance to show the world her gift, but you do. And after tonight, I think it's clear that the world is ready to see it. The silence that followed was different from the cruel quiet that had fallen over our dinner table 3 weeks ago. This silence was full of realization, of shame, of the dawning understanding that they had been wrong. Finally, my father cleared his throat. Danny, we owe you an apology. More than an apology, my mother added quietly, staring at her portrait with new eyes. We owe you our support, our belief, our respect. Claire had been crying silently, but now she looked up at me with something I'd never seen in her eyes before. Admiration. Your paintings are beautiful, she whispered. I'm sorry I said they were weird. I'm sorry I said you should be normal. Marcus was the last to speak. He studied his portrait for a long moment, and I saw him really look at it. Not at the unflattering truth of his stress and perfectionism, but at the skill required to capture such psychological complexity. You're incredibly talented, he said finally. I was jealous. I've always been good at following rules, getting grades, meeting expectations, but this, he gestured at the painting. This is actual creativity. This is seeing something no one else sees and making it real. I can't do that. The admission hung in the air between us like a bridge neither of us had expected to cross. Maybe we could start over, my mother said tentatively. All of us. Maybe we could learn to see your art the way the rest of the world sees it. I looked around at my family, really looked at them, the way an artist looks at his subjects. I saw my father's genuine remorse, my mother's dawning pride, Claire's teenage confusion giving way to respect, and Marcus's struggle to reconcile his worldview with this new reality. And standing behind them all, I saw Grandpa Joe watching me with a satisfied expression of someone who had just orchestrated exactly the outcome he'd planned. You knew, I said to him. You knew this would happen. He smiled, the same slight smile he'd worn while telling me about great-grandmother Rose. I knew you had the talent. I knew you had the courage. I suspected your family just needed to see what the rest of the world would see." He paused, his eyes twinkling. "Though I'll admit, I didn't expect the RIS director to show up. That was just good fortune." Over the next hour, I watched my family move through the gallery with new eyes, seeing my work, and by extension, me, in a completely different light. They spoke with the judges, the other artists, the gallery patrons who had been praising my paintings all evening. Marcus spent 20 minutes talking with Dr. Chen about the technical aspects of portraiture. My mother actually bought a catalog so she could have photographs of all my paintings. Claire took selfies in front of each portrait, posting them on social media with captions about her amazing artist brother. And my father, who had always measured success in dollars and degrees, stood quietly in front of the central display where my first place ribbon was mounted next to the cash prize check, understanding for the first time that his son had achieved something he never could. As the evening wound down and the gallery began to empty, Grandpa Joe approached me one last time. "Your great-grandmother Rose left something else behind," he said, pulling a small wrapped package from his coat. "I've been saving it for the right moment." Inside the package was a set of vintage paintbrushes, their handles worn smooth by decades of use, their bristles still soft and supple despite their age. "These were hers," he said simply. "She never got to fulfill her dreams, but maybe they can help you fulfill yours." I held the brushes carefully, feeling the weight of history and possibility in my hands. "Thank you, Grandpa, for everything." He patted my shoulder with the gentle pride of someone who had just watched his grandson win a war that had been brewing for generations. "Just remember, Danny, true artists don't create to hurt people. They create to show truth. Tonight, you did both. And you did it beautifully." 6 months later, I was packing my belongings for my freshman year at RISD, my full scholarship covering everything from tuition to art supplies. The family portrait series had been purchased by a collector and was scheduled to tour regional galleries throughout the year. But more importantly, the family dinners had changed. My parents asked about my work with genuine interest. Marcus sent me articles about young artists making names for themselves. Claire had even started taking art classes, inspired by what she'd seen that night at the gallery. The evening before I left for college, we had one final dinner together. As we sat around the same table where they'd once mocked my dreams, my mother raised her glass. "To Danny," she said, her voice thick with emotion, "to our artist, to our son who had the courage to show us who we really were, and who gave us the chance to become better." As glasses clinked around the table, I caught Grandpa Joe's eye. He winked at me, a conspirator's smile playing at the corners of his mouth. I had set out to prove them wrong about my art, to show them that their mockery couldn't destroy my dreams. But in the end, I had done something far more powerful. I had shown them the truth about themselves and given them the opportunity to change. Sometimes the best revenge isn't hurting the people who hurt you. Sometimes it's succeeding so completely, so undeniably, that they have no choice but to recognize their mistake and grow from it. And sometimes, if you're very lucky, you have a grandfather who understands the difference between revenge and justice, and who knows exactly when to let both unfold. The crystal chandelier still cast shadows across our dining room table, but now they seemed softer, warmer. The harsh light of judgment had been replaced by the gentle glow of understanding and respect. Great-grandmother Rose's brushes sat in a place of honor on my desk upstairs, waiting to help me create new truths, new visions, new ways of seeing the world and showing it to others. The weight of expectations was still there, but now it felt different. Instead of the crushing burden of other people's limited dreams, it had become the exhilarating responsibility of unlimited possibility. And as I looked around the table at my family, really seeing them, the way an artist sees his subjects, I realized that sometimes the most beautiful portraits are the ones that capture not just how things are, but how they can become.